Over 2,800 people have made it into the 2 Comma Club by making at least $1 million in their business. And you get the opportunity to understand exactly how it is that they have done it on an individual by individual basis through this podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the tidbits and advice that they have, then you should consider subscribing to the 2 Comma Club newsletter, where you'll get daily updates and advice on the podcast and the things that we are learning from the individuals who have made at least $1 million. Just go to 2ccnewsletter.com or click the link in the description down below and subscribe. Welcome back to the 2 Comma Club podcast. Today I'm joined by Amed Hazel. Chris is actually out today due to the fact that he had a little bit of a medical emergency with his eye, but everything is fine. He's getting recovery and all the treatment that he needs, so we'll be good to go. But again, today joined by Amed Hazel. Amed, if you wouldn't mind kind of introducing yourself to the audience and telling them a little bit about what it is that you do in your business, that'd be great.
Hey, John, thank you so much for having me on your show today. So my name is Amed Hazel, and I'm out of Baltimore, Maryland originally. Right now I'm in Georgia, but Baltimore native, born and raised, went to school there, and that's where I sort of started my entrepreneurial journey.
That's awesome. So tell me a little bit about what it is that your business itself is all about.
So our business is really unique, and I would like to say and like to think that I pioneered the space. So what we do, the technical name for what we do is called mortgage-backed securities. However, we define it, we make it simple and say we buy whole loans. And what that's about is the banks, most people don't know this, but the banks are looking to liquidate their assets constantly, because we don't really use something that's called, we use something that's called currency, but we think we use money, but we're not using money, right? And so the currency needs to constantly flow around and around. So the bank understands that. So the bank looks to liquidate its assets all the time. I mean, I'm talking about billions and billions of dollars worth every single month. So when the bank is looking to liquidate its assets, we actually purchase those assets from the banks at a discount. So let's say if someone has a home loan, and the home loan is, let's say, 500,000, the bank may sell that loan to us for, let's say, 100,000. And what they do, because everybody asks the question, why would a bank do that? Well, the bank understands that the dollar is constantly depreciating, and that any loss that they take, they get to write it off to the FDIC. So the bank is constantly circulating its assets, and we buy those assets at a discount, and then we step in and we service the loan for the homeowner.
That's awesome. I love that. It's really interesting because there's a lot of intricacies there around what the product itself is that I'm sure a lot of people are not 100% familiar with. But to give you a little background on the world that I came from, I worked at JP Morgan Chase for a few years, and I was in securities-based lending. And so it was all based on the stock market as the assets rather than the homes themselves. And so I find this really fascinating. I also worked a little bit in the mortgage world as a construction loan analyst. So I got to help
Mhm.
disperse funds for new construction builds and things of that nature. So help me understand kind of what that process looks like for people who, I guess what I'm trying to ask is the banks want to offload this. So who do they normally go to in order to offload those loans?
So originally, the bank was only doing it from bank to bank because they had created a seamless process, right? And sometimes the bank would do something, they would offload these assets so the bank wouldn't go into what they call receivership, right? Which is essentially them being acquired, right? Receivership is when a bank is acquired by another bank. So what we did is we came in and we said, well, you know, all of this stuff is happening with the banks. We can see it leading up to that, right? Because I'm kind of a geeky type of guy, and I'm studying all kinds of stuff. And I'm saying, well, wait a minute. If the bank is holding assets already, so this is pre 2008, if the banks are holding these assets and the assets are not performing, and to just give a backstory, my wife and I, we started as real estate wholesalers. And what we would do is we would go to homes and we would try to broker the sale between a seller and one of our buyers. But we started noticing that every home we went into, that the loan was upside down and the mortgage was the thing that was in play. The mortgage determined whether we were going to be able to make a profit or not. So if the home was, let's say, 100 grand and the mortgage was 100 grand, then there was no room for us to make a profit anywhere if we made the sale. So we started noticing that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes that we were going to that had these adjustable rate mortgages. So, and they were all upside down. And I was saying, to my wife, that if homeowners started defaulting on these loans, which they will default, then the banks and the economy are going to be in huge trouble. So we have been sort of preparing, and we have begun to go to banks and say to them, would you offload some of these assets that you are not getting paid for? And the banks were like, we would love to, but we don't know how to because you're not a bank. So we began to orchestrate this process between us and the bank. And it took probably 2 years for us to figure this process out on how they could actually liquidate assets to us. I mean, getting the contracts drawn up, checking securities laws, making sure that, we were on a straight and narrow and everything like that. And then even to the point where that we would be able to handle the portfolios that they were trying to liquidate to us. Now, some of the portfolios, of course, we couldn't handle because they were in like the $50 billion range and stuff like that. So, we had to weed through all of that to get to a point where we were like, now, yes, we can begin to handle assets at this level. And we were sort of off to the races at that point. And again, most people still don't understand this business, the process, or even know how it works. Even like, top people on Wall Street, because the assets, when they liquidate them, they don't pay like let's say a FINRA broker. Like a broker can't really get a percentage of the sale because it's considered a trash asset. But we began to understand that there are homeowners, families, children, people going to school, husband and wives going to work. We understood because we were wholesalers going in, talking to these families, that they were great people. Although the financial asset may look like it's trash, it's connected to a piece of physical real estate with a family in it. So that's sort of how we kind of, got into the business.
That's really cool. I like that wholesaling background and kind of how it weaved into where you're at now. So, what was kind of like the process that led you to being where you're at now, from going from wholesaling and understanding like the process itself of being able to get those offloaded assets from the banks?
First of all, it was a very confusing and difficult process, an arduous process, because you have several different entities that's coming together to try to make this thing happen. So you got to look at it from the securities perspective, right? So the securities perspective is one asset. Like what you're doing, are you violating any securities laws, right? So that's important to understand, to make sure that not only are you compliant, but that you're over compliant. And then it's like, well, wait a minute, how does this actually tie into the real estate aspect of it, right? And how do we make sense of one and make that line up with the sense of the next thing? And then you have, the homeowner and those laws. How is the homeowner still protected and taken care of throughout this process? And throughout the process in many different ways. Like, for an instance, what if we decided to have the homeowner refinanced by another institution? What is that process like? What if we decided to have the homeowner put the homeowner in a loan modification program? What is that process like? What if the homeowner needed a foreclosure, right? What is that process like? So to take in consideration all these variables took a lot of time, thought, ingenuity, late nights, stand up, stressing to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Yeah, so it was arduous, but well worth it.
Definitely. I mean, just from the limited experience that I have in the corporate world around mortgages and everything of that nature, and then knowing like the SEC and how detail oriented they are in every process and procedure and how the law ties into everything, it's a very fine line to walk that path and operate in a place where you're trying to figure things out in a new lane while also dealing with all of the scrutiny from those areas. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some of like the trials and tribulations you went through during that process and showcase maybe like an example of one of those obstacles that you had to overcome and how you did that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind is like on one of our very first transactions, a bank presented an opportunity for us to purchase. It was an a eightplex in Philadelphia, and we were excited, right? So the bank is going to sell us this 8-unit apartment building in Philadelphia, and they sent me the details on it, and the building looked amazing. And they said that their offer was, or they wanted $12,000 for the unit. So I'm getting my feet wet, and I understand. Like I just got this whole process together, and I'm like, sweetheart, like we're gonna be rich, Uh, $12,000. My wife was like, that's all the money that we have in the bank, and I said, I feel really good about this. Let's go. And she was like, okay, I trust you. And I wired the bank $12,000. And so what I did is I sent a realtor out to see the property. And the realtor said, I got great news and I got really bad news. Which news do you want first? And I said, well, I want the great news first. And she said, this is in a really great neighborhood. It has great visibility, and this could have been a great investment. And I was like, could have been? And she said, could have been. I said, well, what's the really bad news? She said, well, the front of the building looks amazing, but the back of the building is burned down
Oh my.
completely.
Wow.
So in that process, in my thought process, I'm what what do I do? Like this is my first run at this. It feels like I just lost all of the money that we had. I don't know what to do. So I called the bank up to try to back out of the deal, right? So I went straight for my novice inexperience routine. So the bank said, well, a deal's a deal. However, we didn't know that the structure had caught fire. Uh, we called around and we found out that it just caught fire like 3 days before we actually sold the deal to you. So they said we didn't know. So they said, however, you're not going to get your money back, but we will make it up to you over a series of deals. And they did. So that didn't solve the fact that I lost the $12,000, which then I had to go have a conversation with my wife who said she trusted me. But the next several transactions were very lucrative.
Yeah, that's very tough there. With that big of a financial investment not necessarily yielding what you expected it to yield in the beginning, especially when, like you said, you have your significant other relying on you with the family savings and everything. And I understand how tough that is. So I definitely empathize for you in that respect. But I am really curious to hear how it is that it turned out through the rest of those deals. If you wouldn't mind kind of sharing what those opportunities were and then how you were able to capitalize on them to hopefully get the return that you were looking to get from the first initial investment recovered.
So, so first, I learned a very important lesson, a very important lesson. And this is a lesson that I teach. And the lesson is before we wire money, we have to have somebody put eyes on the structure, right? That is something that seems so common sense to do, but it can be overlooked, especially with the agreements going back and forth and the fast-paced nature of the business and, aligning funding. That could be something that's overlooked. So again, we put eyes on it first before we wire money. So over the next several deals, so part of our model is, remember, we were wholesalers, and so we that sort of carried over into what we do. So if this wholesaling model works over here, and we closed on like 135 deals or something like that, if this wholesaling model works over here, can it work in this space too? Well, absolutely. So we started wholesaling, the whole loans, and the bank would say, we have this portfolio of assets. And if you wholesale this section, right? Well, they, in their mind, they're like, we're buying it, right? How we buy it, they don't care, right? But in our minds, we're like, if we wholesale this section, then this section of loans, based on the price point that they're given to us, we will get this portion of the portfolio for absolutely free.
That's
So
awesome.
for us, we were like mind blown, like, wow. So we can actually liquidate these 10 assets, but then these 8 assets over here, the 10 paid for the 8, right? So the 10
That's really
assets
cool.
paid for the whole thing. Yeah.
That's really awesome. So
So
basically, like through that, if I understand correctly, you're shown this whole portfolio. You're able to liquidate the ones to raise the capital to buy the others. Is that right?
yes, yes.
That's fantastic. That's one of those like golden nuggets that you don't come across very often in terms of opportunities. So that's that's amazing.
Yeah, and
Um,
and and we got really good at, like, let's just say that's number one. So then number two would be, uh so Mr. Banker, like, like, this is Amed Hazel, and I'm looking at the portfolio, and you guys sold me the asset that was burned down. You remember that? Yeah, we took a huge loss on that. And I mean, it was just so unfortunate. And I had to really go to my wife and just, basically plead with her to let me stay in this business to help you guys. So, like, on this portfolio that you just sent me, this is portfolio number 2, right? I know you guys were asking for 500,000 for this, but based on the losses that I've taken with your bank so far, I mean, it seems like this portfolio would be really worth 250K, and they would be shocked, but they would let it go, and they would sell it to me for 250K. Meanwhile, I had raised the 500K to actually make the purchase, but I only paid 250K, and I still now got, let's say, another 10 assets for free.
wow,
So I would make money and get free assets.
that's amazing. That is so powerful. I love that. Um,
Yeah.
so to take things a little bit in a different direction, you had spoken about the fact that you teach about this stuff, and I'm really curious to know. Like, I've seen from your Instagram profile that you have some kind of wealth workshop or challenge, and I'd love to know a little bit more about that for our audience, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah. So we have the buildmorewealthchallenge.com, and we normally host a challenge once, sometimes twice a month. And the mindset around it is, like, you and I, especially you coming from the same financial type of background, right? we understand certain things that is just not common. So
Hmm.
one of the things that we begin to teach about initially is how money actually works. Most
I
people
love that.
don't know how it works. Most people don't understand that, again, we're not using money. We use that term, but we're not using money, right? Because money essentially is gold and silver, and we're only using the promissory note to make the transaction. So the dollar bill is simply a federal promissory note, and it says it right at the top of the bill, right? Federal Reserve note. So going back in time, when you would ride into a town or city, you take your gold and you leave it with the money holders. And then they would write you a receipt for how much gold you left. And then you would take your 2 coins or whatever, and you would go get your lodging, get your food, go gamble, cause ruckus or whatever you were going to do there. And the money holder held onto the gold. And when you came back with that paper, you handed it back to the money lender or holder, and he gave you a sack of gold back. Well, over time, they just started trading those receipts back and forth, because if I was at the gambling house and I gambled away my 2 coins, well, it's midnight, the money lender or holder is closed. I can't get access to my gold. So what I would do is tear off a portion of my receipt and hand it in for collateral on my gold that I was going to get in the morning. So over time, we just began to trade that paper back and forth that was backed by gold somewhere. We didn't know, modern day times, we didn't know where it was. We would think that it was Fort Knox, but there's no gold at Fort Knox, right? So that became the basis of the gold, is that it's backed by, or the currency now is backed by this gold. Well, in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard completely, and so it's just paper now. It's just backed by the government's promise that it is worth something. But in and of itself, it is worthless. It is extremely useful next to oxygen, but in and of itself, it is worthless.
Yeah.
So, we're teaching people in the challenge day one how to look at it, because what's most important is that we detach from it emotionally. We've become so emotionally attached to the thing itself, and we're like, yes, it's useful, but it's not worth anything. So for us, when we went through this process, we said, well, wait a minute. If this is the case, then it's going to be really easy to make more of this, because we understand what it is and how it's constructed. So in the challenge, we take a person through, understanding what money is, understanding what assets are, and how to analyze your assets, understanding that what we call, there's a real estate hierarchy, and where you fall on the real estate hierarchy. Then we take them actually day 4 into the actual mortgage note process, how it works, and how deals are done. And day 5, we wrap it all up and put it in the bow so that people can understand how this thing all fits together.
That's really cool. That's awesome. Like, uh, man, I can't tell you how passionate I am about financial education. Like, it is probably the main reason why I do what I do, right? Like, the whole point of this podcast is to teach people, to gather the experts who have learned how to make money and then bring them to a place where they can share their secrets to everyone else, right? But it comes from this place where when I graduated high school, I was told, go get a degree so you can get a good job, and then that's the end of the path, basically. And in getting the first step, the degree, I was handed $110,000 in student loans for a 4 year in finance. That's a lot of money to give to an 18-year-old, And so that begged the question, like, how do I go about making that kind of money? And I worked at a private bank for a while. I got to learn about assets through reading the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, and then viewing simply how business was done for the ultra high net worth clients that the bank I used to work for had. And it really fueled me up to understand that after I had gone through the normal level of schooling through high school and everything, there was a lot of lack of financial education. And then even more so, I got a 4 year in finance. And even that, I didn't really understand personal finance, right? So I'm extremely passionate about this and would love to kind of know where it is that you get your passion for all of this from. Like what was it that happened in your life where it pushed you to want to start serving people in this capacity and bring that information to the forefront for them?
Perfect. I'm glad you asked that question. So, my mom, she was raising 5 kids by herself, and she did housekeeping, right? So she cleaned houses for a living. So she made $40 a day trying to pay for utilities, house, food, and everything. So my mom used to say to me, if it costs more than $5, you're not going to do it, right? So what I started doing was I would go to school and I would take the dollar that I got for lunch. First of all, I would save my lunch money. I wouldn't eat lunch, right? So I would save my lunch money and I would take the dollar that I got for lunch and I would go and buy candy. So I would buy candy, take it to school, and I would sell the candy. Kids in school want candy. Some of these kids got way more money than I had. So that was my first entrepreneurial journey. Well, it got to a point where I was making $60 to $100 per day, more than what my mom was even making. And the school caught wind of it, shut me down, and opened up its own candy store, right? So that was in elementary school. I was
Yeah.
selling boxes of M&M peanuts, right? Peanut M&Ms. So then they opened a full-fledged shop, right? So that put me out of business. So then I get to high school, and in high school I did the same thing. So the high school shut me down on the candy. But then what I started doing is I started selling little teeny bottles of perfume, right?
Hmm.
And essentially it was like body oils, right? So I started selling that. And again, I was making like $100, $200 a day, right? It was like I couldn't even get any schoolwork done because I was making so much money. And that allowed me to really help my mom, right, and help her pay bills and stuff like that, and bring in food for the entire family. Now I'm the youngest, but I'm bringing home $100 a day. It's nothing for me to give my mom $75 of the 100 that I made and keep 25 for myself, because I have a market that's constantly buying from me every day. you know so my passion for this financial space comes from really wanting to help my mom. And whenever I help somebody complete a transaction, or whenever I'm dealing with like one of my mentees or coaching clients or whatever, that's in my mind, which is like, I wished somebody had helped my mom understand like the finance portion of life. And so she paid $352 a month for rent. And the landlord came to her and he said, I want to sell you your house for $3,000, because the landlords at that time, they came around and collected rent themselves. So every month you're going to see him. So he said, I could sell you the house for $3,000 with no money down. You just have to sign the papers. So my mom said no, but she didn't have enough understanding that she could have just signed the papers, and what she was paying for rent would have allowed her to own the house. And she wound up staying in the house like another 15 years. But because she didn't understand, she didn't buy the house, which could have left her many years of not having to pay rent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's where my passion really comes from. Just seeing what my mom would go through each and every month, And when the landlord would show up, seeing like the fear that was on her, not always, sometimes she would only have $300. He always worked with us, and but just to watch that up close and see that that's what she was going through, I'm like, people shouldn't go through this if they just
No, not at
had
all.
the knowledge.
Yeah. And it really begs the question, like, who's responsible for delivering that knowledge, right? And I think that the place where it should be coming from is the place where we receive most of our other knowledge, which would be the education system. But for some reason, they don't put the emphasis there on that, which I find just personally straight up wrong. And I didn't have as um, I didn't have the same story as you did, but there were a couple things that were really similar to our stories there, which I find really fascinating, and I got to speak on it really quick. So first and foremost, selling candy in school, that's awesome. I didn't sell candy, but I sold like soda. I would go to the store and I'd buy like a 2 liter and keep it in my backpack, buy some plastic cups and hand it out for like a quarter in school and stuff like that. Kids would eat it up,
Nice.
and then I'd be able to go restock the next day. And I do the same thing with like cereal. Frosted Flakes was my favorite product to sell because it was the best one. Aside from that, um, I think the deeper part of where my why comes from is actually my parents almost lost their house in the crash of 0809. And it was a similar kind of situation where they didn't really understand the breakdown of the numbers in that capacity. And then it was during that period where I can't remember how they phrased it. It was where the notes and the mortgages were not necessarily backed by like good research on whether or not people could afford them. And so they managed to just squeeze in right before that happened. And then the 0809 crash caused my mom to lose her job. My dad's construction business came to almost a complete halt. And then the only way that we managed to stay in the house was because my father had a great uncle, and he ended up passing away from stomach cancer. And we received just enough money in inheritance to be able to survive long enough for them to get money coming in again. It was one of those like by the grace of God kind of moments. And so I'm curious to know, in your path, like, were there any stories that you can think of where like things were super dark, and then right when they got the darkest, like the dawn came, and all of a sudden like everything worked out fine, and only through like faith and things of that nature?
Absolutely. And the term I think you were looking for is subprime, right? So
Yes. Yes.
subprime is when they didn't do the research to verify whether these people could actually afford the property at the rate that they were going to be, um, you know, selling it to them at. So yeah, subprime. So listen. So I'm in the I'm in this space, right? Going back years, I was in this space, and like every month, I'm doing so many deals, and I'm pulling people out of foreclosure. I'm granting them forbearance plans and all of this, right? But there was something that's weird that happened. So we still lived in Baltimore City, and our house got broken into. And when our house got broken into, they stole everything from us. I mean, they literally
Dang.
wiped us out from this everything valuable, and in the process they destroyed the house, right? So we didn't know it at the time, but what we did is we divorced the house. So
Hmm.
we started spending as much time away from the house that we could. It was like, well, we have to go home, but instead of going home, why not let's go to the movies and watch, 2 2-hour movies. And then we would go home and sleep and get up the next morning, and it's like we were out all day long, right? We didn't want to be there any longer. And although we were saving people from foreclosure, we had actually stopped paying our own mortgage.
Hmm.
And our house was broken into a second time. And the same thing happened. They took all of our computers that we had just bought and everything. So it was pretty dark, and our home went into foreclosure. which was ironic because it's like we are saving people from foreclosure,
Yeah.
and now our home is in foreclosure. And it is to think about it, right? To even in my mind relive it, it was so dark. It was so dark. And I remember while we were still in the home, like we were there, presently there, and they were trying to break in while we were there.
Oh my
So
gosh.
now, while everyone is sleeping, I'm up all night standing guard to make sure no one comes into the house. I mean, they were like spiders, right? They were trying to get in, and eventually it got to the point where um, I said, we just have to move. And we moved in with my dad. Had it not been for my dad, we would have been homeless. And I had an understanding of what homelessness was, but I never saw it from the angle that, wait a minute, a good person can become homeless in an instant, and you see someone sleeping on a park bench and you not really understand how they got there.
Yeah.
And I have a really close friend, his mom passed away, and he's like, I went into a depression, and I saw it happen. He went into a depression, and he said, one day I was asleep and I felt somebody tap me on my forehead. And when I looked up, it was the sheriff. And the sheriff said, put your shoes on and get out. And he said, I went and slept in the park on a bench for like a month. And I said to him, you were like 10 minutes from where I lived. Why you didn't say something? I would have come and got you and set you up. He's like, I mean, depressed, bro. He's like, I was depressed. He said, I couldn't even think about calling anybody. And had he not been, he's a really smart guy. Had he not been who he is, he could have easily become that as a lifestyle.
Man,
Yeah.
that's crazy. Uh, I understand firsthand like what that depression can do. I went through a really dark period of my life where it all started because it was a beautiful period of time, right? Like I had 10 plus years of like a lot of people that I was really close to, good friends, significant other, all that stuff. And then in one fell swoop, literally everyone disappeared from my life like that. And it wasn't anything that I did. It was just a straight up like this person got a job in this state. This person needed to go for this reason, like all this stuff. But it was everybody all at once. And it just left me 100% isolated for like 4 to 6 months. And it was the weirdest experience looking back. I had just quit my job in the pursuit of like building my own business and all these other things. And like, it's amazing. It's amazing how those beautiful memories can be turned into painful ones when they're no longer around. And it's also amazing what you find yourself no longer holding as a standard when you get in that depressive state, right? Like most people, when they're not in that state, will make it a point to find that home, that roof over their head at night, right? But when they're in that state, they end up on the park bench, you know? And
Yeah.
it's amazing to wonder how many of those good people, like you mentioned, are out there right now that maybe suffered from a lack of, a support system or financial education that prevented them from holding that standard of keeping that roof over their head in those times, you know? And so I'm curious to know your thoughts in terms of like, if you were to set up a set of guidelines for people in the wealth space as like a, hey, this is what you should, set up to do to make sure that you're in an okay spot and you don't end up in that position, what would be those guidelines that you would kind of guide people toward?
So that's really great. So let me give you a little bit more of my background. So my dad and my mom, they separated. And so, I told you what my mom did, but my dad was like, I want to say he was like a counselor. Like a lot of you not. I've seen foreign dignitaries come to my father. I've met them in his house, foreign dignitaries, and like seek counsel from him. He passed away in 2013, and I got so many calls from just foreign dignitaries saying, your dad saved my life, right?
Wow.
So when at my mom's house, I was the youngest of five, but my other four siblings had a different father than I did. So I had like the party house, right? This is where all of my siblings, they partied. Now, my mom, bless her soul, she was a very straight up church going woman. That's what she did. And I think that was how she sought her solace from the craziness that was happening in the house, right? So she went to church constantly. So what then happened for me is when my dad came back into my life when I was around 8 years old, he took me to his house and he lived a very wealthy lifestyle. And going to his home was like going to Disney World every weekend. But my
Yeah.
dad said something very important to me that I'll hold as the secret to my success. And he said, son, at this house, he said, I know the house that you come from. He said, but at this house, we read books at this house. My dad was a super avid reader. And I mean, he could go through like a book. He was like a speed reader. He could go through a book extremely fast and remember all of the concepts and principles that the book taught, and then he would begin to live by those principles. So I would be at his house, and my favorite thing to do was on Saturday mornings watch Black Belt Theater because I was like in the martial arts, right? So I'm watching Black Belt Theater, but I'm looking over and I see my daddy just has a book all the time. So I was like, I wonder what he's reading. So I started picking up some of the books and I started reading the books and asking him about, the content. And we were getting to very spirited debates over the contents of the book. And I'm talking about this isn't like Three Blind Mice. This is about, the global shift of the continents and what caused the global shift of the continents and from a geology standpoint, like where certain elements come from. Like we were having those types of spirited debates. And what it did is it leveled me up to a point where when I went back home and I was talking with my siblings, it was strange to them. They were like, the way he's talking, the way he's acting, he's here talking about different herbs and Chinese medicines and teas. And they could care less about any of that, right? The only thing they wanted to know was where the beer was going to come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the secret to my success is everybody has to begin this process of self and re-education because where I came from, the school system did a poor job of actually educating you, right? And what you need. You know, who decided that for me to understand the area of a right triangle, right? And what the hypotenuse of a right triangle, what does that have to do with me being safe going from my high school in the afternoon to home, right? What they should have been teaching is your Miranda rights, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
nobody was teaching anything of what I would call value, and it's not the school system isn't meant to teach you value. It's meant to teach you to become a worker, right? So a factory worker. Well, there's no more factories. So what is the educational system doing? And that's why I've heard stats that say that we're 27th in the world in education. Some stats say that we're 52 in the world in education. Like there's a recent report that says that there is no school in Baltimore, Maryland, in Baltimore, that the students are on grade level mathematically. No student,
Wow.
100% of the students are not on grade level mathematically. What? Is that the student's fault? So, uh, I was so happy and blessed that my dad put the desire in me to want to self educate. So I think
Definitely.
that's the first step. Everybody has to go do something like read Rich Dad Poor Dad, right? Everybody has to go read, um, and this is a shameless promotion, right? But go read Profiting from Non-Performing Mortgage Notes, right? So that you can begin to understand how the system is working and how you fit in it, right? Understanding that there is if somebody says, well, I want to be in real estate. Well, if you're going to be in real estate, there's something called the uh, pyramid, the hierarchical pyramid of who's where on this chart. At the bottom, you're having like wholesalers, bird dogs, and real estate agents that only broker transactions. They don't own the home, they don't own the money. They're just in the middle facilitating the transaction. Well, next you got like the homeowners, you got the landlords, you got the commercial developers, right? These are the people that actually own the property, but they still don't have the money. But then at the top of the pyramid, you have private money lenders, you have note investors, you have people that own funds and real estate investment trusts, and then above that you have the bank chairman or the Federal Reserve. Where do you want to be on this ladder, right? Do you want to be at the bottom or you want to be at the top? You can choose, but choose wisely. And the only way you can choose is by just simply having education. And you can always find whatever you need, especially with everybody walking around with a modern day computer in their hand.
Yeah, amen to that. I really want to second that and lean into what you said there, and iterate another way of looking at it is that part of your success and what I believe my success as well. I didn't have one of my parents being the successful, wealthier individual in the household, but I did have extended family that I got to be around that had a decent amount of money, and through that perspective, it showed me like the differences of what was done in my household and other households versus like that household, right? So just those two succinct places. And I found first and foremost that they didn't have jobs, they had businesses, which was a huge key difference. And then what they did with their money was another big one. But really, where I'm trying to go with this is the idea of like your environment, right? Your environment is what holds the impact. And like you said, to iterate with the modern day computer, your phone, your laptop, whatever, you're able to curate an environment digitally where you can consume the kind of information that will set you up properly, whether it's through podcasts like this or books like yours, Ahmed, and just following the people who are actively pursuing those kinds of outcomes and results. And so I highly encourage everyone who's listening to take it upon themselves to train their social media algorithms in a way where they're surrounded by those people. Just as a testament to how powerful it is, 4 years ago, I started doing that. Maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, I started doing that. Now here I am actually being able to have these interviews with individuals like Ahmed. So this is fantastic. So if anybody wants to get a hold of your book or take your challenge, where is it that they're able to find you and maybe interact with what you have going on?
So if someone wants to read the book, they can go to mortgage notes with an S book.com. That's where we house the book. And for the challenge, they can go to buildmorewealthchallenge.com.
I love it. Um, So one more question before we wrap up the podcast here. But one of the things that I like to illustrate is time is short, right? Like we don't know how long we're here and all that stuff, and there will be a time where we're no longer here. But what's interesting about where we are in society is we live in a point in time where we can record things that'll live on past us. And so what I'd love to do is get out of all the experiences and everything that you've had in your life to this point, what is the best piece of advice that you would leave to humanity for years to come so that way they can be one step ahead in the journey from where we're at currently?
Yeah, very excellent question. I think that there's nothing new under the sun. And that one of the things that I gained from the reading that me and my dad was doing is I was able to look back in history and see the mistakes that were made and do my best to avoid those mistakes. And my dad used to say that all the time. He used to say, you're going to make mistakes, but try to avoid the mistakes that the other people have made. And when we look at great societies, right, we look at how at one point in time, although he was treacherous, we look at the Mongolian society where Genghis Khan basically was ruling basically the majority of the world at one point in time, right? And how they say like one and every like 15 people have some of that Mongolian DNA. That's how many offspring he had, right? But where is he at now? Where's the Mongolian society at now? It's not a world superpower like it was. We can look at the Roman society and see how they were basically world conquerors at one time. But where's that Roman society at now? So all things flow in cycles. And what we want to do is try to look at where the cycle was up for society at one point and what they were doing and avoid the thing that brought them down.
I love that. That's very true, and it goes into something that I was told similarly as well growing up was to not only learn from your mistakes, but from the mistakes of others. And then really that plays into the concept there that you're talking about how history repeats itself. And it's like if you're able to go through and look at multiple different data points and see what were those pitfalls, hopefully if you learn from the mistakes of other people, you're able to actually avoid those. And so it's
Yes.
very true, very powerful. Ahmed, this has been an absolute pleasure. I feel like I've learned a lot today, and I hope the viewers have as well. Where
Thank you,
can people
John.
follow you and check you out on social media?
So I'm on all social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm under Amed, Amed Hazel, Hazel.
Awesome. I'm excited to get this out there. So again, thank you so much for your time, and I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate you so much.